Now we know how they do it in Hollywood, right? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for sticking through to the end, nearly the end of the show. Thanks for being here. And thanks for being you. I don't see any masks in the room at all. It's pretty wonderful. Well, as we all know, the program is running exceedingly long. So I'm going to try and condense my remarks down to the bare essential. So what I'd like to say, instead of boring you with a long talk, I'm going to bore you with a short talk instead. And I'd like to start with a quotation that many of you undoubtedly have heard. It's attributed to, not attributed to, it was actually written by a Chinese philosopher that lived in the 5th century BC. His name was Sun Tzu. And he wrote a little book, it's printed as a book now, called The Art of War. And I understand that all of the military agencies in the world, all of them, use Sun Tzu as part of their curricula for teaching officers in how to conduct warfare. And it's not so much that Sun Tzu had strategies for attack and defense, although he did have some of that, but he was more of a philosopher. And if you look him up in the encyclopedia, you'll find that he's usually listed as a philosopher first, and then he's also mentioned as a famous warrior and leader of the Chinese armies. So he's a warrior. And anyway, he said a lot of things, but the one I want to start with tonight by quoting him is, I think, a very profound statement. He said, if you know yourself and you know your opponent, you need not fear 100 battles. If you know yourself, but do not know your opponent, then for every victory, you will suffer a defeat. And if you know neither yourself nor your opponent, you're a fool. And you will suffer defeat in every battle. That's Sun Tzu. And think about that. Here we are in a battle, literally, for our liberty and our lives, for our civilization, for our families, for our way of life. Everything that's of value to us, we're in a battle, a war. And we have been in this battle for a long time. I didn't realize that when I was born, the battle was already raging, and that goes back a few years. And certainly, by the time I went to school, and the indoctrination process was just beginning in those days, I was getting it. I didn't realize it. When I came out of the university side, I thought I walked out into the America of our founding fathers. I believed, as I was told, that we lived in a land of the brave and the free. I was told that we were fighting wars to protect liberty, to protect America. I was told we had to make the world safe for something called democracy. I was told that this was a land of free enterprise and the free market. I was told that this was a land of capitalism. Little did I know that by the time I came out of the university, all of that was history. I didn't know that. It was like an egg that had been hollowed out. The shell was still there. It looked like an egg. It was light, fluffy, nothing but air inside. All of the great principles upon which this nation had been founded, all of the ideals, the character, all of the goals had been pretty well morphed by the educational system and by the passing of a couple of generations, people who'd lived through hardship and people who were closer to that era where people had fought battles for their liberty and they really knew what they were fighting for. And so I was born into a land of luxury and privilege. And we used to, think, the United States, we'd salute the flag and we'd stand at attention when they played the Star Spangled Banner and we'd be filled with pride, as I still am, by the way. don't mean to denigrate any of that. But what I'm talking is about I had a false image of what was on the other side.
Yeah.
It's different. It was already different then. Most of the things that we talk about defending today were gone by the time I arrived. So it was a harsh discovery, I'll tell you. That was a red pill when I finally was able to see it. And I think of the poor people, even in more recent times, that are out there demonstrating in the Capitol and in front of all the city halls, and they're calling for the overthrow of capitalism. We've got to get rid of capitalism and replace it with socialism. Don't they know capitalism went out with World War I? We haven't had true capitalism, true free markets since then. But we still talk about it. We talk about how we're going to defend capitalism, how we're going to defend freedom. And it's gone. It was gone a long time ago. It was in the process, at least. It's still in the process. Now, having said that, please don't get me wrong. I'm not pessimistic about the future. I'm not pessimistic. I'm not saying it's gone and we can't retrieve it. I'm just saying I'm here to give you a red pill today. This is where we start. To understand and realize the reality of our situation. We're coming in late in the game. And we have to be realistic about that. So I start with Sun Tzu, and he said, first you have to know yourself and your opponent, your enemy. So what do we know about our enemy? Who are they? Who is the enemy? Do we really know? Well, you could take a poll. And some people say, well, the enemy, well, those are the damn Democrats, right? And the others would say, no, it's the damn Republicans. And others would say, well, it's the socialists. Well, it's not the socialists, it's the progressives. Oh, it's the liberal. No. It's the communists. No. It's the Nazis. No. It's the fascists. No. Who is it? We don't know. We give them all these names. We have emotional responses to what they mean. But who can define what any of those words mean? Who can talk to a person for a few minutes and ask them what they believe about this, and that, and say, well, that's not a liberal, that's a progressive. No. These are words, they're hollow words, it's that hollow egg. We use words, we think we know what they mean, but all we are doing is responding to emotional stimuli, to what we think those words are either good or bad. Do we like them or don't we like them? So we don't know for sure who our enemy is. At least I didn't at the beginning. I considered myself during those days to be a right-winger. I thought I was on the right wing because all these people I was concerned about were on the left wing, right? They were leftists, they were communists, they were taking over the world, they were horrible people. They were enslaving people, they were mass murdering people, they were taking away the property of people, the rights of people, they were communists, they were lefts. They were lefts. So I had to be a right, on the right, in order to oppose the left, right? Wrong, left, right. I know I got all confused there for a while, but I was on the right wing, you know? And then somewhere in the process, I realized, we were adopting slowly here in America, stage by stage, Congress by Congress, year by year, vote by vote, legislation by legislation, we were gradually changing our system even further toward the very things that we call left. But since we were calling it right, it was okay. It was like fighting World War II. I remember listening to or reading some of the speeches delivered in Congress, especially speeches delivered by the president, calling for what essentially was a totalitarian system in America. Why? Well, because we were fighting totalitarians overseas. We had to get rid of some of our liberties here so that we could fight a war against totalitarians. So we had to become totalitarians in order to fight totalitarians. But they were the other totalitarians, not our totalitarians, and so that was okay. And that idea bothered me for the longest time. I couldn't get used to it. I couldn't absorb it into my logic. So what did I do? What most Americans do. I stopped thinking about it. Simple. But it didn't go away. Kept coming back. Finally I discovered I won't bore you with those processes, but I started to read some old history for a change. And I discovered that in some of the old books, I mean really old books, 100 years ago, even at the time of before our American Revolution, there were some interesting words that were commonly used that I had never heard before. One of them was collectivism, and the other one was individualism. What the heck is that? Well, it became clear when I started reading those old documents that what we created in America, I shouldn't say we, what our founding fathers created in America was a state, a constitution with for the state that was based on the principles of individualism, which was essentially the idea that the individual was the center of society and that the whole purpose of the state was to protect the rights of the individual. And it even said so in our Declaration of Independence. It said so. I've read the Declaration of Independence many times, but I wasn't really listening. It's right in there. To protect these rights is the function of the state, it said. To protect these rights that were granted to us. Inalienable rights. The purpose of the state was to protect those rights. The rights were individual rights. It said nothing in the Declaration or in the Constitution or any of the Federalist Papers or any of the debates on the floor at the time of the drafting of the Constitution, nothing about the group. It was always the individual having rights. And so I discovered that what we had in this country that we used to call such a great thing was individualism, but they never used the word. Unfortunately, they used the word government. I think that was a mistake, because if somebody said, well, what kind of a government do you want? It's narrowed the debate considerably. That means you want a government, which means you want to be governed. But what if you say, well, wait a minute, I don't like the word. I don't want to be governed. That's not what I want the state to do for me. What if you said, well, wait a minute, the only thing I want the state to do for me, the only reason I give it the power to use force, the only reason I stand still and say I agree to it is to give the state the power to put me in prison or to kill me, if necessary, the only reason I would give the state that power is to protect me. And so I thought that they should have used a different word than government. Instead of saying, what kind of a government do you want? They should have said, what kind of a protectorate do you want? If they'd used the word protectorate, it would have been so much simpler, because it would have communicated with one word that the function of the state is to protect your lives and your liberty. And that's all. That's the only reason you can use force against another human being, is to protect your life and your liberty. And therefore, that's the only thing you can give to the state by voting for some politician to use force for it. He only can derive the power that you yourself have, and that's all you can use force for. Therefore, the state is limited by logic to the defense of life and liberty, period, and discussion. It's not there to educate you, give you home and a job and health care or anything else. It's there to protect your life and your liberty, and period, close the door. And that's the whole principle of individualism. It puts the individual at the top of the social pyramid and the political pyramid. And collectivism, on the other hand, I discovered by reading these old books, was something else. It believed that the group was more important than the individual, and that the individual had to be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. Oh, what a magic phrase that is. People say, well, I suppose it's for the greater good. And so all of a sudden, this issue of human rights becomes a mathematical issue. How many people voted for it? How many people benefit from it? And if more people benefit from it than people who are harmed by it, it's okay? No, no, and no. According to the principles of individualism, which we used to have. A lynch mob is pure democracy. There's only one dissenting vote. Think about that. You would never sign a constitution or a political document that would give the majority the right to take away the rights of an individual. I don't care if it's a majority of 100 million to one person. The concept of individualism is that every human being is at the apex of society, and the greatest good of the greater number is achievable only by protecting the individual rights of each person in society. That is the greatest good of the greatest number. Because once you accept the idea that the greatest good of the greatest number is determined by a vote, and the biggest number of votes clears the game, they win all of the chips, that means any demagogue that can come along can whip up a little passion, get a lot of people, 50%, 0.0001, just one more vote, and they can do anything they want to. Who wants to live in that kind of a system? And yet, that is exactly the system we live under today. And it changed somewhere along the line between then and now. And as I said before, I didn't realize that by the time I showed up, the change had already pretty well happened. But we were still living in those ideas, those speeches, the rhetoric of, this is the land that it used to be, when in fact we had already, starting in World War I, and by the end of World War II, we had completely shifted over to collectivism. It's ingrained everywhere in the state. It's ingrained in our media. It's ingrained in our educational system. It's ingrained everywhere, even in our electric bill. I got something in the mail that said, is your income under a certain amount? Well, we can give you some money back. Oh, how nice that is. But and this all comes from the government, by the way, where did they get the idea that because I am not a certain age, have to pay for an old person's electric bill if that's not on my mind? Maybe I want to pay for somebody else's electric bill. Or maybe I don't want to pay anybody else's electric bill. Since when does the state have the power to force me to be charitable according to somebody else's decision and not my decision? So all right, we're talking about basics now. I'm not here to talk about that. My speech is entitled, Who Are They? So who are they? Well, the simple way of saying it, they are collectivists. And forget these other words. Socialist, communist, Nazi, fascist, liberal, they're all collectivists. And a lot of people who call themselves conservatives also, if you talk to them, are collectivists.
That's right.
The only difference is, like, instead of running and jumping off the cliff to their doom quickly, they go off slowly. And say, I'm conservative. How many will stand on principle? They don't even know what the principle is. Of course, I'm not blaming them. I was there. So our job is to teach and to make people aware of these things. And because if they go off the cliff, we're all kind of chained together, and we will be dragged off the cliff with them. There's a temptation, I think, to say, well, it's stupid people, let them, they'll suffer. Boy, will they find out how bad it is when this turns out the way it's going to turn out, as though it wouldn't affect us. Yeah, we're all in the same boat. So if the boat goes down, guess who else goes down with it? So we have no choice whether we want to be noble and we want to think about the future generations and all of that and posterity, or whether we want to be selfish. We must realize that we have no choice. We must change the thinking of the people, the common people. The question is sometimes raised, well, what can the average person do? My answer is nothing. Average person can't do anything. Average person believes everything he sees on television. Average person is too lazy to want to do anything about it. Average person doesn't care. Average person has no curiosity. So if you want to do something about it, the first thing you have to do is stop being average.
That's right.
And the fact that you folks are here today tells me you are definitely not average. And that's good. And that's why I'm happy to be here and have this opportunity to share a few ideas with you. So back to the question, who are they? I'm still in line one of my speech. All right. So I'm back to this quote from Sun Tzu. If we want to win our battles, we have to know our opponent. So who is our opponent? And I just identified him. I got past that point. These are collectivists. I don't care. Let's get rid of all those other words. They're not liberals. They're not communist Nazis. They're not black. They're not brown. They're not white. They're not male. They're not female. They're not old. They're not young. They're collectivists. They're not a certain religion. They're not a certain race. None of it. They're collectivists. That's what they are. This is our opponent. And it could be anybody. Heck, I was a collectivist once. Does this mean I'm through to 0-0? Is that what that means? No? Keep going. I'm going to turn that thing around and face it the other way. All right, I will keep going because I do. But fortunately, from here on, I'm going to move pretty fast because what I want to do primarily is read a few quotations from people who I would say were they. And the reason I'm going to read the quotations is because the principles of collectivism, which are very simple, I already mentioned one of them, and that is that the group is more important than the individual, are kind of academic, they're kind of psychological, they're philosophical. But once you have these ideas, they translate into actions and into things that change our lives and are more direct. And I'd like to read some of these statements, these quotes that show that ideas have consequences. And so we'll start off with this one, the Club of Rome. Many of you probably know about that. But the Club of Rome is a group of elitists. They're collectivists, every one of them. Forget about everything else. They're just a group of collectivists in high places, most of them. And their specialty seems to be finding a way to justify collectivism as a means of fighting overpopulation. See, a lot of things, anything you can think of that's wrong in the world, like the threat of overpopulation, or the threat of terrorism, or the threat of avarice, or the threat of what? I don't know, you name it. Climate, yeah, environment, yeah. No matter what it is, the solution is always the same. Collectivism, more government, fewer liberties for you and me, more power to the state. That's a dead giveaway that maybe there's something going on here other than the real issues. So this is their group, their specialty is overpopulation. And we all know that if we don't do something to stop overpopulation, why, in a few years, mankind will be a wall of flesh advancing to the sun faster than the speed of light. We must stop that, right? So now, if we're intellectuals and we join the Club of Rome, or more like we're invited to join the Club of Rome, we have to come up with rationale to stop that for the greater good of the greater number. There we are. That's always at the base of this. We're going to have to do some horrible things, folks, and you're not going to like it, but for the greater good of the greater number. So here we go. Club of Rome uses overpopulation as its excuse, and they published a book in 1991. Get my glasses out here. I can read this to you. And this is what they say. Their book was called The First Global Revolution. The First Global Revolution. Okay, here it is. In searching for a new enemy to unite us. Think about that statement. Just stop it. We need a new enemy. It means they make their own enemies. Think about that. That's true, by the way. They do. And here they say, we need a new enemy to unite us. It came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention. The real enemy then is humanity itself. That means we got too many humans, so You're not going to like it, but we're going to have to get rid of a lot of humans for the greater good. Now, Bertrand Russell, you may remember him. He's a collectivist, a well-known author, philosopher. According to the encyclopedia, here's how they describe him. He's a Fabian socialist. We'll talk about that in a moment. A British philosopher, mathematician, historian, atheist, writer, social critic, political activist, prominent member of the Fabian Socialist Society, and, of course, a Nobel Prize winner. They all get a Nobel Prize when they're really good at this. So, here's what Bertrand Russell wrote. I do not pretend that birth control is the only way in which the population can be kept from increasing. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect. Disappointing. We don't kill enough people in wars. But perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. Oh, let's try that. If a Black Death could be spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors then could procreate freely without making the world too full. A scientific world society cannot be stable unless there is world government. It must be necessary to find ways of preventing an increase in world population. If this is to be done otherwise than by wars, pestilence, and famines, it will demand a powerful international authority. This authority should deal out the world's food to various nations. I just stop on that for a minute. This world authority is going to deal out the food, not the people who grow it. It's not going to be the local communities that control it, nor even your national community. It's going to be the world government will deal it out to you. And it says, so the nation, in various nations, if any nation subsequently increased its population, it should not, on that account, receive any more food. The motive for not increasing population would therefore be very compelling. End quote. And that's the understatement, of course. These guys don't play around. They're not going to wait for you to do the right thing according to them. They're going to force you to do it, which is another tenet of collectivism, by the way, that people should not have freedom of choice to do anything that they think they should do. They're going to be forced to do it by God or pay the consequences. Now, I spoke briefly here about the Fabian Society. How many people here know about the Fabian Socialist Society? Oh, pretty good number. That's pretty good. It's an obscure organization. It shouldn't be. It's in England. It was formed quite a while ago, over 100 years ago, and all the intellectuals and the wealthy elite who were interested in political and social, quote, reform were members of it, and it's a very powerful organization. Tony Blair, for example, was a member of it. A lot of top British politicians are members of it. And instead of all that, I'll just say it's a very powerful, wealthy group of collectivists. That's their idea of what they wanted to bring to the world. I could talk for a long time about them because it's a fascinating group, and much of what they stand for is contained in a stained glass window that used to be in the headquarters of their organization in Surrey, England. It's called the Webb House. It's owned by Sidney Webb and his wife. I forgot her name right now. Anyway, the Webb House. And the glass window, the stained glass window, I had seen drawings of it, but I never had seen a photograph of it until about 3 years ago. It showed up. Somebody had it in their warehouse. And it showed up. And it was donated to the museum locally, and there was Tony Blair there for the photo op, standing looking at this little picture about this big, of the stained glass window. So, okay, what's the deal with this stained glass window? There's a lot of symbolism in there. For example, they had a picture of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Okay? That's part of their philosophy. Don't let the opposition know what you really are up to. Be secret about it, lie about it, be deceptive. It's important political strategy, you know. But the thing I wanted to mention is that the main center of the thing was a depiction of the earth on an anvil. And on either side of it was a figure of Sidney Webb and Bertrand Russell, who was another member, famous author, philosopher, intellectual. They're standing there on either side of the earth with sledgehammers in their hands. And they're whacking the heck out of the earth. What's that all about? Well, they explain it. At the top of the stained glass window, here are these words. These are the famous words from Omar Khayyam. Dear love, couldst thou and I with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire? Would we not smash it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire? Think about that. That, ladies and gentlemen, explains what to so many people is absolutely unexplainable. Why is it that leaders all around the world are participating in acts that are destructive? We tend to say, well, these are good men and women. They must not understand. We must inform them. Well, let's send them a letter. Explain it to them. This is not working. Don't you see us? I mean, we can't shut down all of the stores and the businesses in America and destroy the economy. It's not going to work well, you know. Why would you have to know that this is not going to work? They know it's not going to work. They are trying to smash it to bits.
Yep.
So they can remold it closer to the heart's desire, which is what? Collectivism. And they brag about it, they write about it, they talk about it, they write poems about it, but nobody reads it except their own groups. And once we understand that that is the philosophy, not all of these people around the world who are doing it are members of the Fabian Socialist Society, but they all are following that concept. Destruction is the goal. Destruction for the value of destruction. To force people on their knees, begging for help to survive. Then they will accept any insult to their liberties, to their property, to their bodies, anything, so they can just survive. This is the strategy, and these are what they believe. The Fabian Socialists, the Communists, the Nazis, they all believe the same thing. Destruction, bring people into terror, bring them into panic, bring them into fear, so they will not question anything you offer as a solution to save them from this terrible crisis that they themselves have created. It's hard to get your head around that because we were born into America, right? They don't do that in America, do they? No, we wouldn't allow it. I was born into America that would not permit that. So therefore I have to reject that as being even a possibility. And this is the problem that we face today, is that people do not know that this is a conscious and well-described strategy. Maurice Strong is a very good example of that. Maurice Strong is very, very well known in international circles. He's also a member of the Club of Rome, by the way. He's the kind of people. A very high-ranking individual at the United Nations. He's involved in almost all of the high economic forums and committees and divisions at the United Nations. He travels around in very elaborate circumstances, talking about the need to conserve. One of those guys. Club of Rome member. He was interviewed by a young man by the name of Daniel Wood. And that interview was published in May 1919 issue of West Magazine, which is published in Canada, where Maurice Strong has his primary residence. He has residence all around the world, including one of the biggest landholders in the United States, in Colorado. And he has a huge ranch there. And when Daniel Wood went to interview him, he was invited to spend a week at the ranch of Maurice Strong. So he really had a chance to see everything and observe everything and ask Maurice Strong everything he wanted to. And he wrote this article. Now, this ranch, I have to tell you, was visited regularly by such interesting people as David Rockefeller, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, founder of the World Bank, that was Robert McNamara, and presidents of such organizations as IBM, Pan Am Airlines, Harvard University, etc. All right, this is the ranch. And so now here we go back to this article that David wrote. And in that article, he explained that Mr. Strong was describing to him an idea for a book that he was writing to express to the world through the form of a novel what he really believed. But instead of just writing an essay on it, he said, I'll put it into a novel. So now as I read this article or passage of it, keep in mind the present crumbling economic situation in the world today that was created, for the most part, by deliberate political action. Okay, here we go. Each year, he explains as background to the telling of the novel's plot, the World Economic Forum convenes in Davos, Switzerland. Over 1,000 CEOs, prime ministers, and leading academics gather in February to attend meetings and set economic agendas for the year ahead. Which, although of course is true, that's reality. So that's the background. And then he says, that not quoting from the author of the article, quote, what if a group of these world leaders were to conclude that the principal risk to the earth comes from the actions of the rich nations? And if the world is to survive, those rich nations would have to sign an agreement reducing their impact on the environment. Will they do it? The group's conclusion is no. The rich countries won't do it. They won't change. So, in order to save the planet, the greater good, right? In order to save the planet, the group decides, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? This group of world leaders, he continues, form a secret society to bring about an economic collapse. I sit there spellbound. This is not any storyteller talking. This is Maurice Strong. He knows these world leaders. He is, in fact, co-chairman of the Council of the World Economic Forum. He sits at the fulcrum of power. He is in a position to do it. I probably shouldn't be saying these things, he says. And just let that sink in for a minute. I'm not saying that Maurice Strong had anything to do with this, but what I am trying to communicate to you is this is the thinking that is the consequences of holding the idea of collectivism, that you can do anything you wish in the name of the greater good. And we won't even talk about whether you really believe it or not. You can just claim that you believe it and people will more or less accept it. Now, let's turn to a guy named Dr. Ottmar Endorfer. He's co-chair of the UN International Panel on Climate Change. And here's what he says, quote, one has to free oneself of the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. Let me repeat that. One has to dispel themselves of the illusion that climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy, he says. We redistribute de facto the world's wealth, end quote. Now, he's the top dog there. One of the top dogs. Now, there's a guy by the name of George Monbiot, I guess you would pronounce it. He's not so well known, but he's a British environmentalist. And here's what he says. He says, we've got to go straight to the heart of capitalism and overthrow it. This is what motivates people. Now, they may talk about the environment, they may talk about viruses, they may talk about, terrorism or whatever it is, jobs, education, racial discrimination, pornography. I mean, you name it. But what they're really after here is striking to the heart of capitalism to overthrow it. What that means to them is the remnant of what we used to enjoy in our world and what we must now become warriors to bring back. Now, are they really trying to save the planet, protect us from a virus, or do they have some other agenda more in tune with their lifestyle and their record? I'll leave that for you to answer, but it's a question I think we need to keep constantly in our minds. But I would suggest that the true answer was provided by another well-known collectivist. His name was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was one of the original Bolsheviks. He was one-time leader of the Red Army. He was a member of the first Politburo. And here's what he said. The basis of bureaucratic rule is the poverty of society in objects of consumption, with the resulting struggle of each against all. When there is enough goods in a store, the purchasers can come whenever they want to. When there is little goods, the purchasers are compelled to stand in line. When the lines are very long, it is necessary to appoint a policeman to keep order. Such is the starting point of the power of the Soviet bureaucracy. It knows who is to get something and who has to wait. End quote. I think everybody should read that every morning when they get up. Because this is, in my view, the primary motive behind all of these world leaders. They want to be the person or part of the group that decides who gets something and who has to wait. Because under that kind of a world, they are absolute rulers of mankind. If you're wondering what's driving these people, who they are, what motivates them, that's it. Nothing more complex than absolute power over every human being on the face of the earth. This then is who they are, what motivates them. I'll just simply summarize by saying they're collectivists who claim to be serving the greater good for the greater number, but who hope to rule the world with absolute authority and no ability for anyone to challenge them. So that's my red pill for today. Thank you for listening.